crane there that's capable of lifting any aircraft that's due to land off the runway to keep the show going. And so we learned our lesson, and the RAeS learned their lesson to make sure that we've got the correct tools and resources available to us at all times. Just to highlight the aim there, to give you an insight of our roles responsibilities as we go through this presentation. We are operational, and we're responsible for prime roles is rapid runway clearance. There's an example here in the picture. Recovering UK MIL crashed aircraft, and the worldwide recovery and transportation of all MOD assets. And that could be anything in and out of theatre. I'll concentrate on this little picture for now. This was a Harrier upside down in Cyprus on the runway, blocking a very strategic runway. I won't go into too much detail because it's one of my case studies later. But as you can imagine, the devastation there. Fortunately, nobody lost their life, but it was a very sensitive recovery due to other nations operating from the same airfield. So our aim was to get there as quickly as possible, conduct the investigation, remove the wreckage, and return the operating surface back to the operators as soon as we possibly could. We also transport aircraft parts and large uncrated components. Large uncrated components, this is an example of one. It's not a complete aircraft, it's a centre section of a C-130 Hercules. This was taken to Porton Down in Wiltshire down the back lanes, so you can imagine it's overhanging an extra wide trailer already, so you can imagine the fun we have travelling through some of the country lanes around Salisbury and Wiltshire. This was taken to Porton Down for ballistics trials following a mine strike in Lashkar, so they wanted to try and replicate the explosive damage that happened when it was out in Afghanistan. I think there's a couple of pictures of that to come further on in the presentation. So there's a secondary role. We'll transport people's large uncrated components around for them. So JARTS are a team of 75 people, and our prime role is post-crash management. Obviously, things don't crash all of the time, which is very good. Post Haddon Cave, the safety record has improved significantly. The amount of incidents that I've responded to, I can virtually plot on a graph how they've dropped off significantly, and that's good. But we still need to be current, capable, and effective. So to do that, we transport all of the assets around, as well as assisting other agencies. So we do that by land. You can see a Typhoon here on the back of one of our bespoke trailers going into depth maintenance with the crane in the background. We do it by sea. I appreciate Sea King is out of service, but it's a good pictorial using one of the Point class ships down at Marchwood. We also transport a lot of aircraft by air, a lot of rotary assets and a lot of the smaller aircraft that will fit within any of our transport fleet. If our transport fleet's not big enough, we'll use the Antonov fleet or the American Galaxy. Picture there of a Red Arrow in Crete, pre-season training. Unfortunately, there was a mid-air collision. This one landed safely with minor damage to the wingtip and to the tail. The other one was a total loss and was scraped up off of the field. Again, no loss of life, so a result all round. We recovered this aircraft back to the UK and it was returned to service relatively shortly afterwards. So if you think now we're going to do all of post-crash management activities, we're also moving everybody's assets around the world by land, sea and air, a team of 75 people. These transportation tasks can, back in the day, which isn't that long ago, they were numbering 400 movements a year, so it's more than one a day. We've got a team out of the door. I think last year in COVID, we were down to about 200 because we're only doing priority movements. But as you can imagine, 200 is still a significant amount of movements on top of the post-crash management. If we've got any spare capacity after that, we will move people's historics, gate guardians, museum pieces, wreckage for post-crash management exercises, etc. This is where the guys get their improvised experience and to keep current with improvised ad hoc lifting techniques and stuff like that. Because with a crashed aircraft, you don't always know where the centre of gravity is. So a very important part of our training is to keep current with historics, gate guardians, museum pieces and the like. So you can see how this squadron of 70 people is growing now to be a very busy squadron, maybe up to 400 moves a year, although not last year. All of the historics, all of the post-crash management activity. So if we go back to our prime role, recovery of aircraft, we work in conjunction with the investigators. JARTS are not an investigation branch. We assist them, and I'll explain how we assist them in the next few slides. But a couple of examples here. 10 years ago, I appreciate, but a C-130 at Brize Norton landed complete wheels up, and it needed recovering a very strategic runway that had to be cleared as soon as possible. And that was conducted within 16 hours from start to finish, and the runway was returned to the station commander to commence operations again. So that's an example of rapid runway clearance. The Merlin in El Centro, which is one of my case studies for later, that took me a month because of the logistics involved, and not just the fact that it was in California, although it might have had something to do with it very slightly. But sometimes people ask me how long it takes, and it's very difficult to put my finger on exactly how long a recovery will take. But that's the extremes, I would say. Rapid runway clearance to a very lengthy recovery over in the USA. As well as doing all that, we also support the Air Accident Investigation Branch. This is civilian incidents with a civilian organisation. We do that under a memorandum of understanding with between the Department for Transport and DABE, Defence Accident Investigation Branch. Prior to the military having their own investigators, we used to use the AAIB for all military investigation. And it was a really good reciprocation that we would do all their recoveries, they would do all of our investigations. That's not the case anymore, but the MOU is still extant, and recently we've responded to all civilian incidents. The picture here being of the Boeing 777 at Heathrow, believed to have ice in the fuel. We weren't allowed to recover the fuselage, that was done under contract, but you can imagine the debris field this side of the aircraft. Just to the rear of the aircraft, you can see main landing gear for a 777, and to the front of the aircraft you can see the nose landing gear also in the grass from the 777. So we were able to plot all of this wreckage. We plotted any strike marks, any witness marks, every single bit of wreckage, presented that to the investigators, and that aided them in their investigation to determine the causes of this incident. So that's another responsibility on top of all of our prime roles and responsibilities. How can we get notified? Military incidents will always be via the DC DSTO. If we get activated any other way, I will always courtesy call the DC DSTO to let them know that we've been activated. And the excellent thing about the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff Duty Officer is he's got resources available to him. Under his standard operating procedures, he can call out any resource that I may need. And I've just got to put a call into Whitehall to this guy, and before I know it, I'll have a crane, I'll have a truck, I'll have real life support, anything that I may need to facilitate that recovery. It's a civilian incident. As I just said, we've got the Air Accident Investigation Branch. The first picture being the Merlin on its side in El Centro. I'll go a little bit more into that. This picture is a yak near Boscombe Downs, so it was a quick response time for us. And there is a third way we can be activated, and that's if the operator owner, it says level K here, which is like the squadron boss. If he can't recover it, or he thinks it's outside of his capability, then he can call us indirect. And this is where the downbird comes in, I suppose. The aircraft isn't damaged, but it's not repairable in the field, so we would go out and recover it on their behalf. So that's the three avenues where we could potentially be called out. Myself as the aircraft recovery officer, main point of contact with JARTS, qualified and experienced in aircraft recovery. Fortunate is a strange word, but the most experienced recovery officer in the UK military, with coming on for 30 incidents responded to over the nearly 12 years I've been in post-crash management. So, and that's all in different roles, but mostly as an aircraft recovery officer. You saw the picture of the Hercules centre section being taken to port and down in a previous slide. This is the Hercules that hit the daisy chain of munitions on the operating surface, the natural operating service out in Afghanistan. The guy in the middle, a good friend of mine, retired, Jeff Vaughan, he went out as a recovery officer to effect a recovery. There was absolutely no point in recovering this aircraft, and it was denied and disposed of locally in theatre. The vehicle that you can see next to Jeff was the British ambassador's car, sorry, which was allegedly carrying bullion and banknotes. None was ever recovered. I saw Mr. Vaughan in South Wales recently, and he's certainly enjoying his retirement. So I don't know what he got out in Afghanistan, but he's certainly keeping well. I'm on call 24 hours a day, 1 week out of 4. I'd prefer to do 2 weeks out of 8 to get it over and done with, to give me a little bit of respite. So yeah, a quarter of the year I'm on 0 hours to respond. I'll try and get anywhere in the world as quickly as I can, really. And the picture here of a Harrier, Kidlington Airport, it overshot the runway, come through the hedged line at the end. And if you look in the hedge, you can see the back of a dark coloured vehicle. That was an off-duty policeman that was struck by the Harrier. Nobody was hurt, which was brilliant. But the off-duty policeman was able to call the incident in, and he's already doing my job for me before I arrive, because it's natural instinct for a police officer to cordon, control, protect personnel, and to preserve evidence, which are my key roles and responsibilities. We'll come on to those a little bit more in a minute. So fortunate, some may say, or some might not say, that this Harrier managed to hit an off-duty police car, and he was able to control the site until we were able to arrive to take over. But it says there, worldwide, as soon as possible. Current COVID restrictions might slow me up a little bit, but I'll get there as quickly as I can. My responsibility is then to ascertain hazards at the crash site, to work in conjunction. A couple of abbreviations here. You've got Royal Air Force Centre of Aviation Medicine or the Institute of Naval Medicine. They're both my environmental health tech organisations. I'm not a specialist in health and safety, they are. So we work in conjunction with each other to ascertain the hazards and put control measures in place. I'll control all in-cordon activities, which is personnel being exposed to any dangers and the complete aircraft recovery. So any other organisations that arrive at the site will not need to access the aircraft unless the aircraft recovery officer allows them into that site. The only exception to that being my environmental health guys, which I've just mentioned, or the investigators and the aircraft recovery officer and his team. That's the only people that will be allowed onto a crash site. The picture here, a watchkeeper, I think the tail number is evident on that picture. I know they've lost several, and this one's in Wales. This produces its own set of risks because it's suspended in a tree. So you've got trees to fell, and you've got sprung trees which in themselves are deadly. You know, if you've got a tree under tension and you need to cut it down. So it looks quite benign, that little crash. It's a small aircraft stuck in a tree, but that is a nightmare waiting to happen. So we need to be really, really careful, ascertaining the hazards and controlling them as much as we can. So it's got a few of my responsibilities here. Look, health and safety at work, environmental protection, protection of the evidence. That's huge, isn't it? Protection of personnel. And then once the investigation's over, we'll transport the wreckage to wherever it wants to go. If it's civilian, it will probably go to Farnborough. If it's military, it will probably go to either Boscombe Down, because they are also co-located with us, Defence Accident Investigation Branch, or to an airfield of choice. If there's fatalities, generally it wouldn't go to its home unit, because that would be a bit of a conflict of interests. The reason I've left this picture up here is just to show some of the support we get from external agencies. The two guys in the orange jumpsuits over by the fence line, we can't always put a huge cordon in place. This was in Leicester, just outside of the football ground, the King Power Stadium. Unfortunately, all on board lost their lives. All 5 people on board lost their lives. So this is attracting huge media interest now. So we've got aircraft overhead, we've got long lenses looking in from all angles. So these guys are actually working for urban search and rescue from the fire service. So they're going to put some sheeting up for us. You can see there's a tarpaulin covering the business end of the helicopter. The wood in the foreground, the urban search and rescue guys are brilliant for this. They'll put up a tent to stop any prying eyes, and they'll build it from scratch, you know, out of tarpaulins and wood. And that just gives us a little bit of respite to work unhindered, away from the media. And I think it's a little bit more sensitive towards those lost as well. Once the investigators have conducted their investigation, and once I'm happy with the EH guys that it's safe to do so, then we'll effect a recovery as soon as possible. There's no point in leaving it there any longer than it needs to be. There's a long list of hazards that I might need to consider. I'm sure you can see those different explosives, gaseous systems, even like a tire can be deadly if the wheel is damaged, full fuel tanks, accumulators, and the like. This is the second largest crash site after Lockerbie that JARTS have ever responded to. It was unfortunately shot down by a US Patriot missile, so it's a blue-on-blue friendly fire incident. But because it's high altitude, it tends to spread a long way. And this was actually over 26 square kilometers, this aircraft crash. So you can imagine the recovery officer has to maintain a robust cordon around 26 square kilometers. It's virtually impossible. Luckily for this site, it was quite remote in Kuwait, so it was okay. But imagine Lockerbie, which is several hundred square miles, which is obviously a civil event, but JARTS were heavily involved in the recovery of that aircraft as well. Another point to note on this one, when you think you've got all of your hazards covered, the picture can soon change. There was an AMRAAM missile on this aircraft which had buried itself into the desert, and it was quite stable when it was not exposed to oxygen. But as soon as it was dug up, the warhead started to cook off, which presented a whole new raft of health and safety issues. So just because we think that we've covered all the health and safety issues, they can reappear just as quickly as when we think that we've got rid of them. Things we need to consider then is different materials, different modern metals, because especially if they're burnt, different fuels, lubricants. You can see some of the composite fibers here hanging out of a wing of an upside down Harrier, again on the road. This is not the Kidlington aircraft. So Harriers used to keep us busy, Tornadoes used to keep us busy. Obviously, both gone out of service now, and the safety record has improved. So we don't tend to do this type of work as much as we would. One of the final things I need to consider really is ballistic parachute system, ballistic recovery system. This is a parachute fitted to a single engine aircraft. Quite often they're retrofitted without the warning signs, and it's got an explosive charge. So I'm very, very wary approaching an aircraft that may have sustained damage if this hasn't actually deployed. Even if it has deployed, doesn't mean that the explosive has activated. So sometimes you need to be even more wary of that. Unfortunately, 2 firefighters in Germany have lost their lives due to ballistic recovery systems. So yeah, if I go to a single engine light aircraft, I'm always very aware that it may have one of these systems fitted. How do I know what the hazards are? I'll look at this is a document which is within the military net, and it's got all military aircraft on it. And it's basically a starter for 10 to tell me what a basic aircraft hazards could be. It doesn't mean to say it's all the hazards, because it won't take into account explosive stores attached to the aircraft, but it's a good starter for 10, and then I can speak to the operators and the experts at site to finalise the remainder of any hazards that I've got to deal with. And from there, I will get the lads dressed up accordingly. Ideally, I want to get them down to no PPE as soon as possible, because it's much more comfortable for them to work. And if they're required to wear higher levels of PPE, they're exposed to higher levels of risk than what I would prefer. So yeah, my job will be to get them down to the lowest level of protection as soon as possible. I talked about Lockerbie a little bit earlier. So we need a robust cordon. How can you cordon off something that's hundreds of square miles? Obviously, the main part of the wreckage is relatively contained, but it was across villages, across countryside, moorland. It was huge. This was before my time. This was in 98. I believe that's wrong. 98. I'll just look into that. But we just need to be aware of contaminating people. These guys here aren't particularly well dressed, and they're within a cordon. But this was before the JARTS team were able to get there and advise accordingly. So we just need to be careful how we protect our personnel. Recommended cordon distances: 400 meters complete aircraft, 800 meters if it's an armed aircraft that's damaged. If you drew an 800 meter radius around anywhere, you're going to take into account probably a town or two. It's not realistic to evacuate all of that unless it's deemed essential. An example of a cordon here being, this was the very, very unfortunate recovery of John Egging, Red 4, Red Arrow. I was a recovery officer on this recovery. And there's just a few key features here. We use the tree lines as cordon and the river running through the centre of the picture. I realised that we couldn't maintain the cordon, so I rang DCDSDO and he sent me 40 young naval personnel from Yeovilton, and they split into 2 shifts to guard the site around the clock. This is a 60-acre site just for one little hawk. So if I just move my mouse over the screen, hopefully you can see it. This was the impact mark. You can see the red and blue dye from his drop tanks. The wing came off here and landed about here. You can see the line coming across here, which was the fuselage, which heading towards the river, roughly at 400 knots. When it got to the riverbank, it hit a tree and T-boned the aircraft. It turned it through 90 degrees. And that took the cockpit off. It then hit another tree, took the tail off. You've got the fuselage now barrel rolling across the river into the opposite bank. So effectively, I've got 3 crash sites to manage now. I've got both sides of the river and in the river. So it was a complex recovery over 60 acres. So we need some real life support. You can see in the foreground here, I've got some, this is a mess tent and a headquarters tent, and all the vehicles were parked here. This was the control of entry, controlled by the civil police. This was where the nose landing gear was found. So you can imagine it's a huge distance. And we needed to get all of the debris out of the river, because here on the left of the picture was a weir where the children used to play. And the last thing I want is debris and that coming up on the weir where children are playing. And then a little red tent, I don't know if you can see it, that was the Salvation Army who used to make us sandwiches, bacon butties in the morning, which was very well received. But that's just an example of how you could use natural things like hedgerows, walls, rivers as a cordon, but it still needs to be robust. So if you can't do that, then you need to bolster it with personnel. Another role JARTS have is GPS mapping using the land survey system. We're currently trying to get this replaced with newer equipment. Basically, it's what you see at a building site or on a motorway, where they're with a base station and a man holding a theodolite. The military version is more accurate than probably what you'll see on a building site. And we're able to plot, as I said, with the 777 at Heathrow, we're able to plot witness marks, all of the items of wreckage, and present that to the Board of Inquiry or the investigators to aid in their investigation. This is the unfortunate last flight of the Tornado F3 before it went out of service in Scotland, flying too low, too fast through a valley. They want to know what happened. So our data, coupled with the cockpit voice recorder, coupled with the aircraft data recorder, they were able to work out exactly what they were doing and potentially what they were doing wrong, although that's not for me to say. We just present the evidence. And if I could move on a little bit, don't get hooked up on the amount of detail on this, but this is a hawk crash at Mona in Anglesey, North Wales. All of the information on there can then be put into a 3D pictorial, so you can see the fuselage and the wing is removed. The wing generally removes itself on a hawk, but we were able to, the impact mark being here, all of the blue area here, this is all canopy from the MDC detonation, and the aircraft came to rest with the wing stuck in the ground. And over this side, if you can see the mouse moving, you'll be able to see the parachute where the pilot landed safely. So from that, we were able to overlay this onto a 3D fly through and on ordnance survey to present to the investigators. And it turned out that there was a hump in the runway. A very inexperienced pilot, his first time away from Valley, landing at Mona Airport, and the hump caught him unaware, of which one of his wingtips dipped, contacted the ground, and he came off onto the grass and he ejected. So that's the sort of input where we have into the investigation, if required to do so. If they don't require that facility, then we will just effect the recovery for them on their behalf. This was an aircraft I recovered in February last year, just before COVID restrictions were in force. I'll just go a little bit further into that as one of my case studies a little bit later on. But as you can see, I'm using an RAeS team there, a remotely piloted air system from Honington, to give me some evidence. Another way of gathering evidence. So we offer specialist cutting techniques, chainsaw operators. This was the very, very unfortunate incident at Shoreham Air Show, where the hunter failed to come out of his loop and he landed on the main road. As you can see, the aircraft's pretty much intact despite the fireball that we've all seen on the news. That aircraft needs removing, so the investigators will tell us where they want it cut. We'll cut it up, transport it, and potentially lay it back out or pseudo rebuild it for them so they conduct their investigation at their own pace. They obviously can't conduct a full investigation when it's across a main road. Civil fire service there just standing by in case there's any fire incidents. If I can't access the vehicles I need through military source, then I will hire them in with my company credit card, and that could be anything from the snow equipment that you can see up to tracked vehicles. I've had to hire a barge, a hovercraft. So it is big boys' toys on occasion, not all the time, but sometimes needs must. Ben McDewey was 2 F-15s, mid-air collision. On that occasion, we had to dig out all the snow to get it all clean, to get all the hydrocarbons removed from the snow. The American Pavehawk in Norfolk was in a marshy area, so that needed specialist track vehicles, as you can see here. So no two incidents are the same, and we don't have the resources available for every single incident. My final job as aircraft recovery officer is land remediation, and that means I need to restore the ground back to its pre-incident condition. I can't do that. That's out of my specialisation. So I'll call Defence Infrastructure Organisation in, or their civilian counterparts, and we'll work in conjunction with the landowner to find a suitable remedy, really. But that has to also be in conjunction with my environmental health guys. The hole that you can see here was in October 15. Some of you may be aware of an F-18 crash in Cambridgeshire near Ely. So the amount of hydrocarbons that leaked out of that F-18 was quite incredible. And this hole was dug just to remove the contaminated land. That hole alone, with the contract to clean the soil and to remediate the land, cost £1 million. So it's no easy task to get the land back to its pre-incident condition. Sometimes it's not possible, but we have to work in conjunction with the land agencies, the infrastructure organisation, landowners, and in environmental health to make sure we get it back as close as we can. There's a list of organisations there I could use. The list is pretty endless, but I need catering, I need signals, I often need police divers. Things that might not be on there is a forestry commission. I might need to cut down a forest if the aircraft is suspended. Maybe not a whole forest, but you know some trees may need to come down. The picture was the tornado at Holbeach in the Wash, presented its total own set of problems, being a kilometre offshore in thick mud. So we tried all assets, from a barge, a hovercraft, floating pontoon. We got the salvage and mooring officer involved. We had every rotary asset we can imagine trying to lift the wreckage out of the mud. And just the sheer fact that it's a kilometre offshore presents its own challenges, you know, on the mud flats at Holbeach. We did get out eventually, but it was a protracted task just due to the working environment. The lads were absolutely exhausted by the time they'd even got to the site, and they only had a very short window due to the tidal range. I talked a little bit just then about salvage and mooring off. So if it's below the high water line or in inland waterways, I will call the salvage and mooring officer, who will assist with the recovery, as you can see here from the Harrier and Lowestoft. That was an air show, but it was just offshore on the beach, bowing to the crowd, I believe, and then ejected. There's normally a video in this presentation, but with it being virtual, I can't show the videos because they crashed the system. But this pilot ejected, thought, oh, that went well, but he landed back in the cockpit of his own aircraft and broke his ankle. So he didn't have a good day after all. He was safely recovered though. What JARTS can provide: basic accommodation. You can see here, we can provide like a tented village. We can link all these tents together to provide decontamination areas, accommodation, mess hall, recreation room, briefing facility. The list is endless. Whatever we think we need for the enduring operation, we'll take it. And this can be air transportable or road transportable. And it is a really good setup. It really is. Just coming to the end of the current roles and responsibilities. So we will provide specialist trained personnel. I'll control the inner cordon, health and safety and EP, which is my main roles and responsibilities. We can plot the site using the LSS system, like I said. This picture here, there's actually 2 crashed aircraft on this picture. In the middle ground, you can see a Gazelle all bagged up, ready to be recovered off the hill. It was such a remote site that the lads were getting taken up and down the mountain every day by a police helicopter. And it just dropped the final set of lads off to carry on with the recovery, but then crashed right in front of them. Luckily, only minor injuries, nobody was killed, but it just goes to show you how easy this can happen. It's a bit of a JARTS claim to fame, and it's their fastest response time ever, because they were actually on site 2 days before the incident happened. So yeah, that's JARTS claim to fame. I said earlier, how long will it take? Again, if it's a downbird, a low energy helicopter in a field, it could be recovered in a day. If it's a high energy impact, several hundred knots over several square miles, then it could take a month. So yes, it's a very difficult one to call. I'm going to put the next slide up. Any questions? I think that we're going to wait until the end of the presentation for any questions. This was in the center of the picture in the blue tarpaulin. That was the fuselage from the Hunter at Shoreham. And you can see there's lots of different agencies working there together, including the JARTS team and the fire, civil police, investigators. Quite often you can have up to 40 different agencies working at a crash site at any one time. So that concludes. So far we've talked a little bit about the history of post-crash management from the World War II to present day. We've talked about JARTS' current roles and responsibilities and all of their extra responsibilities, including transportation of aircraft. What I'd like to do now is move on to a couple of experiences or case studies, call them what you will. So the first experience I put on here is a Merlin recovery in California, Southern California. Sounds lovely. It's a quite inhospitable desert down near the Mexican border, and it really isn't as nice as it sounds. If I said El Centro rather than California, it probably paints a better picture. So in the picture here, we've got 6 JARTS lads, including myself, in the center of the screen. I've got 2 environmental technicians, both civilians, although they're wearing certain amounts of military uniform. And this guy here is the lead investigator. So the 6 that I'm highlighting now are all the JARTS, and then we take out the investigator and the environmental health to keep us safe. I was told, get yourself out to America. There's been a Merlin with a heavy landing. I didn't know what to expect really. Quite often we get short, garbled message, said your flight's booked so and so, get yourself to Heathrow, you're going to fly into San Diego and you're leaving now. So it's like, that's fine, I'm on call, I'm on immediate readiness, my bags are packed. So I get to San Diego, get picked up, driven 2 hours into the desert, and had a meeting, and they said, oh, the aircraft's on its side. I said, oh, I wasn't told that. I said, can we go to the site and have a look? So this is pretty much what we turned up to see. It's quite remote. The sand is very soft. You can't drive on it with a conventional vehicle, and we're roughly 200 meters away from a hardened road surface. It's a landing zone for all British military parachute training, and they're still conducting that training even when this aircraft is in its current condition. You can see at the front of the aircraft there's a huge debris field. That's where the blades hit the ground and pretty much thrashed themselves until they were non-existent. Coming in a little bit closer, you can see that the guys were very lucky, guys and girls. It was a nighttime landing. They were doing dust landings, so they were what they call a brownout landing, and they lost reference. They hit the ground and skipped sideways, and then the aircraft rolled over. All people escaped. There were injuries, but they were relatively minor. I think there was a damaged vertebrae and a damaged ankle was pretty much the extent of the worst of the injuries. But this is what I turn up to the next day after flying out to Southern California. The aircraft is only holding itself up by this very, very weak stabilizer that you can see is almost about to fracture in the middle. So this is where our cordon control, protection of evidence, preserve health and safety, or protection of health and safety preserving evidence comes in. There were people walking under that tail unit. That tailplane was due to fail at any time. So we put a cordon up, and then we started to assist the investigation, working in conjunction with the Environmental health. In the meantime, the guys got busy. I hired a disc cutter from downtown and bought some fuel, and we started wrapping. As you can see, they're composite materials, so we wrap everything up in cling film to stop the fibers. So now was the day I required a crane, but the ground was too soft for a conventional crane, so I had to get Marco to bring this special crane in. In fact, he bought two because I wanted to do a double lift. But this crane was able to lift itself off of its own trailer, and the size of the balloon tires allowed it to travel effectively across the soft desert. But as you can imagine, that's not cheap, getting two specialist cranes into the middle of a desert to recover this asset. Some countries may not bother recovering it, but the British military always try and recover their assets and return them to service because we don't have a lot of them. There's myself on top, just getting the second crane connected onto the sponson. What I didn't want to do was lift it from the rotor head and slam it down into the ground. And what I didn't realize at the time, that one leg was actually detached, and that detached main leg turned the recovery from a simple operation to a very complex operation. I'll explain why. As you can see there, the hire car with a red strop is removing the detached undercarriage leg, which now leaves me an aircraft with a tripod undercarriage with two legs in the middle of a desert, and they want me to bring it back to the UK. There's me talking with Marco, appointed person. We've obviously got halfway up, and we're just discussing how we're going to write this aircraft. And we do. We get her upright, and we disconnect one crane, and she sat there quite happily. Again, as you can see, there is a leg missing, and we're in the middle of the desert, and we can't travel with the crane with an aircraft suspended like this. So what I have to do is I go down to Home Depot and I buy a load of mattresses and wood and get the wood cut. So I make a Jenga block and rest the aircraft on this whilst we leapfrog it with the crane to try and get it back to the hardened runway. When I get it to the runway, obviously it can't be transported conventionally, so I put it on mattresses. I can't really think of anything else to put it on, really, just to try and protect the underside of it, which is always very soft structure on a helicopter. You can see the damage to one of the legs here. I then need to transport it back to its operating base, which is only about 20 miles away, and offload it into the hangar, awaiting return instructions for the UK. And you think that was pretty much the end of the task, really, but that was definitely not the case. The Environmental Agency in California, if you're going to crash an aircraft, don't do it in California. This doesn't look too bad, does it, now the aircraft's been removed? But there was a significant amount of hydrocarbons and fuel and oil put into the sand. And California State Environmental Health come to me and said, you need to remove all the hydrocarbons. So I thought that would be a simple enough task, just dig a little bit of sand out and dispose of it. They sent me 7 skips and a bulldozer, and I had to dig 70 tons of sand out of the ground and send it for cleaning in Los Angeles, obviously a long way away from Southern California, at a cost of roughly about $50,000 just to clean the sand. After it was cleaned, and apparently to clean sand of hydrocarbons, all you do is heat it up until there's no sign of hydrocarbon left anymore. After they cleaned it, they rang me and said, do you want it transported back? Of which I said no, because we'd already backfilled the hole by that point, and I didn't want to pay again. Transportation day, I asked for a ship to come into San Diego, which was relatively close. They said no, the ship's coming into Galveston in Texas. So I'm now left with a poor Merlin resting on mattresses on a truck that I need to do an 1,800-mile trip across America, coast to coast. And that trip was interesting, to say the least. It took me 5 days. My initial plan was to sleep in the back of the helicopter, buy some camping equipment and just rough it for a few days. What I didn't realize was leaving California in +30, going through Arizona into New Mexico, we soon hit -20 with the snow, as you can see on this picture. So I quickly changed my plan, and we parked at military establishments every night and stayed in a hotel. So that just gives you, when you think you're going out for a basic Merlin recovery that's had a heavy landing, and you get there and the logistic problems that you encounter made this job, which I thought might take a week or so, because of the road element, the transportation back to unit, the fact that one leg was snapped, the fact the aircraft was on its side, actually took me a month pretty much. and that was delivering it to Texas and putting it onto a British military ship to bring back to Southampton, to Marchwood. I picked it up from Marchwood and transported it in a similar fashion to Fleetlands, and it was dropped into the jig, which it fitted, and within 12 months the aircraft was returned to service. So it was an absolute win-win. It was a little bit expensive at times, but the fact that we got the aircraft back into service ultimately saved millions and millions of pounds. So that was a big pat on the back for recovering that aircraft. We've since given all the Merlins to the Royal Navy, and I think they're mainly operated from Yeovilton and Coldrose. That sort of ends my first scenario. So we're going to quickly move on to the second one, Harrier Recovery in Cyprus. This aircraft blacked a strategic runway that a US asset was operating from at the time. That asset, it's pretty much open source information. You can Google it. Needs a set of undercarriage legs in which to land because it jettisons them on takeoff. It's now taken off on an endurance flight. We've done this to the runway. A Harrier upside down on fire. This is stock image taken from the unit. It wasn't on fire when I got there because that was probably a day later. But it happened right outside the fire section. They were on call and they put it out within a couple of minutes. It literally happened right on their patch. So when I turned up, this is pretty much what we were confronted with. Upside down Harrier, damage to the runway, significant debris, fuel oil contamination, and ejection seats and debris all across the airfield. It is believed that the pilot didn't have enough water on board to do the maneuvers that he was doing because demineralized water is injected into the exhaust to give it extra thrust, and it's believed that it didn't have the right configuration of water, potentially, although I can't confirm or deny that. As you can see, quite significant debris. The aircraft was on fire, most of the fuel burnt out, and we were told, get out to Cyprus as quickly as possible, there's an incident with a Harrier. Again, it's pretty much very, very little information. The picture does unfold whilst we're traveling, but we're probably not contactable so much then, especially not when we're airborne on Civair trying to get into Limassol Airport. We get taken up there as quickly as we can, and you can see the devastation. This is about a quarter of a mile short, so this is where the ejection happened. You can see all the canopy splatter here, and the seats are on the runway just in front as well. It was a passenger flight for a non-air crew for one of the engineers, so minor injuries were sustained, but nothing too serious. We can't affect the recovery until the investigation is completed and we're convinced that we've got any health and safety issues under control with control measures in place as best we can. And if we can't control the hazards, then we'll put safety barriers in place such as PPE and exposure times and that accordingly. You can see here the poor Harrier has been recovered. So this is a quick recovery because of the asset that the American asset that was airborne had to find a diversionary airfield, and I think it found one in southern Italy with a set of legs that it was able to land with. So the immediate rush is over, although it's still a strategic airfield in Cyprus that we needed to return to service as quickly as possible. So we recovered the airframe as was, and I transported it into the hangar and put it down inside an aircraft hangar so the investigators could carry on their work. I thought that was pretty much the end of my job on this particular recovery, so I transited back to UK. On returning to UK, my boss said, oh, they finished the investigation now, can you go and transport it back to the UK? So I returned to Cyprus, and we dismantled the aircraft with saws under advice from the Defence Accident Investigation Branch, and returned it to the UK and took it to the HAS at Boscombe Down. When we were cutting this aircraft, though, there was still significant amounts of fuel. You can see the lab with the fire bottle there. Unfortunately, that didn't cut it, so we had the fire brigade on standby. When we were removing wings, especially because they caught fire on several occasions, only small fires, but they were significant enough for us to warrant having the Cypriot Fire Department there watching over us at all points. So this is another example of a strategic runway, rapid runway clearance, being operated out of by another nation, the US in this case. We need to effect a quick an effective recovery to return the operating surface back to the host nation, the British forces and the US forces. And it provides its own set of problems, as you can imagine, all the way through. The station commander said to me, how will I know that you've recovered all of the debris and that I can operate safely from my runway? So I replied to him, I said, if you get all your station personnel out, get them shoulder to shoulder and walk the length of the airfield, then that should be pretty much good assurance to you that your airfield is clear of any debris. And he said, oh, that was a brilliant idea. So he did that. And I've never seen so many bags of debris presented to us for consideration in the investigation. Some of it was off aircraft that have not been in service for years. There was panels and tools and all sorts. So it was a timely reminder, I think, to Akrotiri to maybe conduct their checks a little bit more frequently, put it that way. And again, this was classed as rapid runway clearance, so it was effected as quickly as possible. Again, I will take questions at the end. I'll come on video and take any questions you may have. So, moving on to the Apache in Lincolnshire, February 2020. I was called to a remote grid reference in Lincolnshire, where they said there's an Apache in a field. I thought, that's pretty standard. We'll just go and recover it for them. What I didn't realise was that how wet the field was. It doesn't look wet until you try and walk on it, and then you sink up to almost shin deep in very, very soft mud. I couldn't take any vehicles on there, apart from the farm vehicles, ironically, and the local landowner was absolutely fantastic. You can see here we had snow on the ground. You think that would firm up the ground? It didn't. The aircraft is resting on its external fuel tank one side. It's resting on the gun underneath, and very soon to be resting on its missile pod on the other side. Tail of the aircraft has sunk. We're probably about 100 feet, I would say, maybe 30, 40 meters from a single track road. If it was a big road, I would get in a big crane with big outriggers, and I would just pick the aircraft out of the field and put it on the hard standing. That wasn't the case because I was on a single track road with a drainage ditch either side. So you formulate a plan as you drive into the site, and then you get there and you think, that's not going to work. As you can see, the gun has probably stopped it sinking a little bit now because it started to take a little bit of weight of the aircraft. The main wheels are pretty much underground. So when I arrived there, the British Army were on site. They'd been there for a couple of days before admitting defeat, pretty much, just because they don't have the expertise. It's not that they weren't capable of it, because we still used all their assets to recover the aircraft. But they didn't have any real life support. They didn't have a cookhouse. They didn't have portaloos or highlighting, as you can see in this picture. They had nowhere for the lads to get out of the weather. So the first thing I did was I escalated this through the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff Duty Officer from a downbird to an aircraft incident, because it just unlocked resources for me then. So I was able to get those things in. A portaloo. We got a field catering squadron set up in a grain store just so that it was undercover, but they set up their tents within a barn. We were able to get hot food when we needed it, do a shift rotation on the site, because all it was ultimately was a lot of digging, and we dug and dug and dug, probably for 2 days, pretty much straight. We'd try and effect a recovery with different types of matting, different boards. You can see in the foreground, some of them had better success than others, but ultimately they failed. So it was back to the drawing board. So we started removing weight from the helicopter by taking the tanks off, removing the fuel. We got a bouncer in and with an extra long hose to remove the fuel, and carried on digging until we were confident that we were able to one final pullback. So we just dug very, very shallow gradient holes to get it back onto some good matting. And this is some of the hardware we had. So we had a big bowser, a big crane, big winch, again, big boys' toys, working on a single track road next to drainage ditches. It's not easy. It really isn't easy. We put some matting out over the field, as you can see. This is my most relieved point during the whole recovery, quite late at night, and we actually got the aircraft out of all the holes onto some hard standing with no secondary damage. So my plan is to get this aircraft returned to service as quickly as possible. That was it for the night. I said, that's it. I'm not working through the night any longer. There was a night guard allocated we had the highlighting in place, so we left it on that day. We come into the next morning to an absolutely glorious day. Again, the field was too soft for us, so we had to leapfrog the matting. The farm vehicles, I don't know how they do it. It's absolutely incredible. They have no impact on the ground at all. Whereas if I take a truck on there with similar size wheels and tires, we would sink up to our axles. So it's a little bit of farmer's magic, that is, how they've designed these vehicles to not sink into the ground. All of our vehicles had to stay on the road. Luckily, the landowner was totally on side and he did the aircraft movements for us to get it back nearer to the road. We got it as close to the road as we could on the matting, as you can see, using the landowner's equipment, and we picked it up. That's a 30-ton wrecker with a 15-ton arm on it, and it's absolutely fantastic. So you can see the helicopter's lost its blades, it's lost its MMA ball on the top, all the fuel's out of it, any stores are off it. So we've reduced the weight right down, probably to about 6 tons. So we were able to pick it out the field and put it on the road. And here's a picture of it actually on the road. You can see how narrow it is. You can see the drainage ditches, and that's what reduced my capacity to put a massive crane there to pick it up. This is the imprint, the tail wheel where my mouse is currently, the main wheel's here, the gun in the middle, and it carried on sinking. The day after this was taken by the remotely piloted air system, the whole field was underwater. So we had a window of opportunity and we had to take it. So there was a lot of damage done by us to this area of the field. You can see the nice green lawn in the top right. That was damaged by vehicles turning into quite a posh residence, just churned up his entrance a little bit. So that's where I called in the Defence Infrastructure Organisation to work out some compensation. So the barn that you can see is roughly about a quarter of a mile down the road, and we towed the aircraft down there into the farmyard, and the barn is where I had my catering squadron. So that's where we were doing our eating and ablutions, etc., and keeping warm between each iteration of the recovery. And this was probably about day 4 now. So we got it out of the field and we're safely back into the farmyard. So if I go back to that picture, you can see the wings are still fitted. There's still significant equipment on the aircraft. I tasked the RAeS to get it ready for road transportation by the following morning, and they took the wings off and removed any ancillary equipment. A JARTS vehicle specifically for Apache turned up. Apache is very, very long. So the trailer is at full stretch. The trailer and head unit is over 100 foot long. So significantly longer than what you would imagine a normal flatbed to be, which is 44 feet. So in excess of twice the length of a normal vehicle, and very, very low so that we can clear the bridges, etc. And pretty much dropped it onto the trailer, and now it becomes a standard transportation, apart from the fact that we're on a single track road in the middle of extremely rural Lincolnshire. But we picked a route, recce'd a route, and we got it out. So that was probably a 4 or 5 day recovery. But you can see now that it's not just to drive to the field and pick it up and put it on a trailer. There's always challenges which present themselves during a recovery. Right, I've just got one more very quick set of pictures that I'd like to run through with you, and this was the very, very unfortunate disposal of the Victor from RAF Marham. This was conducted during October, during lockdown. As you can see, all the team there are socially distanced as much as possible. When you're conducting this type of dismantling activity, it's not always easy to maintain social distance. We were effectively a bubble, and we remained in that team the whole time. Myself here, I wasn't stood centre because I wasn't the team leader. The team leader was a Chief Petty Officer from the Royal Navy. My role there was to move the aircraft from its plinth, pneumatically elevate it, cut the plinth off, lower it, move it to the car park, raise it, remove the undercarriage and lower it onto the car park so that the guys could then dismantle the aircraft. So that took me about 10 days. And that was just the expertise with the pneumatic elevation of such a beast that nobody else on the team had the experience for. So that was my sole role. And once that was done, I left the site then. I let them carry on and dismantle it, of which I've got a few photographs here. It was really unfortunate. The aircraft had gone into disrepair. It's iconic. It's part of our heritage. We do have them inside in museums, so it's not like it was the last of a kind or anything like that. But I still think it's an absolute shame. It was put up for disposal. It was put up for tender but whoever wanted it would have to dismantle it and take it away, and it was just too big a job for anybody to take on. So unfortunately, we got instructed to dispose of it. This is a stock image. I forgot to take one when it was on its plinth, but it's raised off the ground. The wheels are all clear of the ground on metal stands in the middle of a load of gravel. So you can imagine I've got logistic issues straight away. I can't lift off gravel. So I put the matting out. It's the same matting as you saw on the Apache in the field. It's called mammoth matting. The rolls weigh 1 ton each. They're just interwoven with steel rods and extremely heavy duty nylon, and they're absolutely fantastic. You can see under the wing we're starting to build a stack here. We used to use railway sleepers in the day, but they were too heavy, so these are made out of recycled plastic. They're quite expensive, about 50 quid a pole, but it saves a lot of time and resource. So you build a stack, and then I'm going to put my pneumatic elevation on top of that stack to lift from the wings and the fuselage. I'll show you a picture of it lifted in a minute. Once we'd lifted it, cut the plinths off, lowered it back down. I tried to drag this aircraft on sledges, but it wasn't going so well. So I thought, you know what, we'll just try, even though it's been there 30 years, we'll just try and tow it conventionally on its undercarriage. So the big vehicle you saw lifting the Apache out, I've got 2 of those at the back of this aircraft. So the Army work in conjunction with the Army, one pulling off each leg, and we just pull it back. There's a picture of myself there controlling operations with a radio comms to all parties. And as you can see, the aircraft is pretty much back onto the car park. This is before it's towed, just getting ready. Outside station headquarters at Marham. There is a plan to put a Tornado there because the aircraft historically flew Tornado. So there's going to be a recently refurbished Tornado going in its place very shortly, of which JARTS will go and lift that into position for them as well. Here's one of the Army helping us. You can see all the tyres are totally deflated. That's good, because if they were inflated, I'd be worried that the wheels weren't sound and we could end up with a high pressure incident. So the fact that they're deflated is actually a bit of a bonus. Once we got onto the car park, atmospheric shot with the sunset, it's time to lift the aircraft again. As you can see, we're building the stacks again. The guys are starting to remove the underwing stores. I can't lower the aircraft down to the ground until the underwing stores are off. That presented its own challenges because they've not been removed for 30 years. You can see some pneumatic airbags here, look, lifting the aircraft for its final time, unfortunately, in one piece, put it that way. All the bolts are seized, so you can imagine we need to get some big cutting equipment out. This is a thermal lance we used to cut off the legs, which sounds a bit severe, but it was the only way of actually getting through the corroded bolts of the legs. The nose leg is gone now. This is literally suspended on pneumatic bags. The pneumatic bags here are a maximum pressure of 7 psi, and they'll lift up to 30 tons on each bag. I had 4 airbags on this aircraft, so that's more than capacity enough to lift this aircraft. As you can see, all the underwing stores are off and the aircraft is now lowered to a safe working height for the lads to dismantle her. This was my part of the contract finished effectively, so I let Chief Petty Officer Burton continue from here to remove the aircraft. To dismantle the aircraft. You can see the size of the undercarriage there. Some of the bolts come out conventionally, some of them were cut off with the thermal equipment. A couple of shots of the lads sectioning the wing to get the aircraft narrower and narrower. We were told that everything had to fit inside a skip that was 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters. We would still be there now if we did that. So we pretty much ignored that disposal contract and we took the aircraft to the scrapyard ourselves. So we were putting in to the highways agencies wide load, abnormal load paperwork and taking the aircraft for disposal ourselves. Before I left site, the guys started removing the tail unit. I said to them, we don't really want to be doing this at night. And they said, no, it's fine. We'll get this off pretty quickly. So nightfall came and they were still getting it off. They did get it off in the end, but they were working under torchlight towards the end. But once they started it, I said, you've got to complete it. You can't leave it hanging there half cut off. It's quite sad, really. You can see the rear section on the truck on the left, the nose section is removed and moved to the side. and transported to the scrapyard as is. We saved the artwork, we saved the fin and the roundel and the tail numbers and stuff like that for museum pieces, but unfortunately the rest of it went for disposal. Is the last piece being loaded and taken to the scrapyard. So you can imagine the logistics of this. It needed lifting twice pneumatically, needed manoeuvring back onto a hard standing, and then needed sectioning. This is all the capabilities of JARTS, and this is perfect training and perfect currency for our personnel to keep them ready for post-crash management activities. Right. That was a quick canter through. I think that we've been going about and almost an hour and a quarter now. So it is a very quick canter through for the amount of information that you've received. That concludes the presentation from the history through from World War II to present day, current JARTS roles and responsibilities. And then I put in 4 different scenarios, which gave you an example of post-crash management, rapid runway clearance, a downbird recovery, and a historic, which is the 4 scenarios that I put on the slide.
But thank you again for a most delightful, entertaining and full of facts brief. We haven't had anything like this in the past, and I'm very grateful for you giving up your time to talk to us.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. You're more than welcome, and I'm glad it was well received. Hopefully your audience thought that as well.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay, cheerio now.